So you guys, so it's that time of day again to just tell you that I'm really doing much better in terms of my music production now. And because I'm doing much better, I want to teach you some things that I've been doing in terms of my music production that's going to help you if you want to be a music producer as well. So for example, with techno, I found my direction now. I found exactly what I want to achieve in terms of my music. And it took me 5 years to be able to find a direction in terms of which genre I want to go in and which direction I want to take in terms of my music. So, what I mean is that it took me 5 years to find direction in my music in terms of which genre I want to produce. So, for example, there is house music, techno music, trance music, hardstyle music, R&B music, soul music, jazz music, rock music, I mean, electronic music, focused music, sleeping music. I promise you. So you have to understand that these days, now more than ever, I want to create 120 BPM techno music. And that's my direction. And why is that? Because I see something in techno music that I can do. For example, I can do techno music because it helps me grow. But the thing is that what I do in my techno music, for example, is I make plug sounds. And what a plug sound is a really short sound. And I loop the sounds together to make this nice and beautiful style of music that you can hear it and it's like a melody in the background. But then what I do is I go on Splice, and if you haven't went on Splice before, you have to understand that this is for producers out there who are looking for sounds and looking for things out of the ordinary kind of thing, where they can get any kind of sound they want and put it into their system or into their DAW or digital audio workstation, and they can be able to really, let's say, be able to fill in the music track with sounds. So what I've learned recently is I'm using Splice now much more, and I'm filling up my techno sounds with sounds, because Armin van Buuren says that if you want a good music track, you have to fill it up with sounds. So that's what I've been doing with splice and loops and stuff. I've been using loops, I've been using white noise, I've been using deep sounding percussion and stuff like that. And I've been using ambience in my music as well, which means that I use reverb, okay? And I put the decay in my music all the way fully to maybe 70% decay. And what I do is, let's say I have a percussion, and perk stands for percussion. So, for example, I have a percussion, and I make a sound, and then I put a reverb on it. And what I do is I go and nicely put a reverb on it in terms of decay on 70%, so that it just goes throughout the track in ambient form. So I've learned that. But the thing is that it's much more how I've been using reverb to great effect now, and I understand exactly what reverb is now. I understand that before I didn't know how to use reverb. You understand? So now these days, how I EQ these days, which is equalizer, which means that you cut out certain frequencies from your track to make it sound nice to your definition. So you cut the sounds to make it sound the way you want it to sound. So what I'm doing in terms of I'm looking at the what I'm doing in terms of equalizing is I'm looking at the equalizer on the instrument, and let's say the equalizer is more in the middle. So that means I cut out the low end, I cut out the high end, and I make it more middle end because I follow the spectrum of the EQ. So for example, my sub bass is in more in the low end, so I cut off the high end and the mid end and the middle end, and then I just leave the low end on the sub, for example. But for the kick, I either I boost the kick sub for a bit, and also I go up the middle of the middle end of the kick, and I just raise that. I raise the middle end of the kick, and I may also put like a little percussion or perk on the kick to tap with the kick, for example, so that it pumps out into the mix, for example. So what I've been using with sidechain, for example, is I have maybe with Kickstarter, I have been using maybe 30%, 45%, 55% in terms of sidechain. And I find that it helps the melody to come through, but also helps the kick to pound through. But also what I do is I try to put the kick as the loudest instrument in the track, okay? And then when I go into mixing, for example, what I do is I start to really, let's say, I start to mix down everything and I start to lower the volume of all my instruments, okay? And I leave at least 12 dB, 12 dB room for my sounds to be in the mix, for example. So all my sounds equate to minus 12 dB, for example. And then when I go into Maximus, for example, what happens is I what's it called? I click the preset and I go to Clear Master, and I press the Clear Master preset, and this boosts my whole sound into a louder version of, let's say, my soundtrack's going to be louder and it's going to be much more full, for example. So you have to understand that when I make techno music now, I make short sounds and I make decay with reverb. And what I do is I try to make it ambient, but also use white noise. And I try to fill up with effects as much as possible with my music tracks, as much as possible to have effects inside of my music tracks. So for example, if you guys are out there and you're, let's say, trying to do better, for example, I realize what you need to do is you have to realize that music production is a part of life. So if you start music production and you start your first album, for example, you have to realize that I made over 500 tracks. I made over 500 music tracks in my life. And I cut it down to 4 tracks. So from over 500 music tracks that I made, I cut it down to 5 tracks. I mean 4 tracks that can be in my album. So you can see how much I failed over my 5 years of music production. So when I started music production back in 2014, you have to understand back then the music was nice and it was a really good time to be in the music industry. But I went on music production. I started doing music production for 2 years, and then I stopped doing music production for 4 years. So from 2016 to 2020, I wasn't doing music production. I was doing more life coaching. And I was reading a lot. And now you have to realize that these days now, since I'm actually much better at my music production now, I realize that's the whole key now, that you have to realize that since I'm actually doing better now in terms of everything that I'm doing now, I realize that I have a spot right now for myself to really develop my music production now as much as possible. So that's why I'm getting into the frequency of being able to role play with myself now in terms of better ways. I'm being able to really grow myself in the best kind of way forward. And that's what I'm actually always thinking about now is my health. I'm thinking about my career. I realize with DJing, I can start DJing my music now. I can start, let's say, playing around with my music and just seeing the different effects and stuff of my music channel and stuff in terms of my music tracks, my music soundtracks. But I'm really happy with the way I'm going with my techno music, for example. And the universe, in terms of many people out there, are saying good things about my music now. And they really like it. But there have been some critics as well. I realize there's been some critics who may have said the build-up's too long, or there's nothing changing in the track, for example. But you have to realize that I look past that. I look past the critics, you understand? I don't rely on the critics to be able to do my music, you understand? Because when someone's always criticizing you and telling you what's bad about your music, for example, you have to realize that you have to learn from it, but never take it to the heart, you understand? Never get angry because they criticized your music negatively, for example. Yes, and so you have to realize now I've reached a nice and beautiful peak in my life now in terms of music production, and I go into my door, and what I do is I can either make a melody first, or I can go and, for example, be able to really, let's say, loop my music. So what I do is I loop my music. So what I do is I make a little melody, or I can start with a kick and sub, for example. But I usually start with a melody, okay? And what I do is I make a little melody, and then I make the melody maybe 1 bar long. Yes, and then maybe duh, 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 like something like that. And then I might put as a bass line like in the background, and I call the bass line like the motor of the track. You understand? It's like the motor. It's like what gets it going. You understand? And I put a sub bass in there. I use Serum to put a sub, for example, and I just add the sub off the kick. You understand? And it's off beat. You understand? So my sub is always off beat. And then on the kick, what I can do is I can place either percussion on it. Yes, I can place percussion on it so that the kick comes out in the mix, for example. And also, when I EQ my music, I make sure I look at the spectrum. I see if the spectrum's more in the high end, I make sure that that instrument goes in the high end. And if it's more in the mid end, then the same thing. I put it in the mid end. You understand? And if it's more of a low end kind of track, then I put it into the low end. But what I try to do is when I'm equalizing, I don't want to lose the sound. You understand? I don't want to lose my sound. So I shape the sound into a sound that I want in my music track. You understand? So sometimes when I EQ, sometimes the sound doesn't come out as much as possible. So what I do is I try to never reduce the equalizer. I try to expand the equalizer more so that that sound can be perfectly the way it is in the mix to begin with. In terms of how I began with, how I begin my music tracks and stuff is I start looping it. I start looping a sound. So for example, I may have a kick, duh, 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 and then I might play duh, 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 and then I might play dun 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 dun. I might play that in the background. Then I put a clap. I put a hat. I mean, clap and hats are really easy to put in the mix. You understand? It really gets the track going. And then I find loops, for example, that have perks or percussion in it, and they have little clicks and stuff like that, and I put it in and stuff. I make sure it's unique, that goes with the track. For example, I make sure my loops go with the track. You understand? So I pick the loops out from Splice, and then I add white noise. For example, I add like a dun, something trancy or something like that. And then if I find maybe something that's a bass line that's like a psytrance kind of thing going, I can add it in the mix as well, but I use a loop for that. I don't try to go create my own type of, let's say, psytrance kind of melody line, you understand? And why is that? Because right now my skills in terms of being able to make a sound that sounds really good in terms of bass line is non-equivalent right now. You understand? I'm able to do it with practice. You understand? But the thing is that you can find sounds that really shape your music track online somewhere. You can find those sounds. You can find a sound that's perfectly made in terms of psytrance already, and you can put it as a loop in your mix. You understand? And that's what I do. So, for example, I put a downlifter, I put a riser, I put also I can put snare rolls and stuff. I can put a snare. I realize none of my music tracks have a snare at the moment in terms of my album, and I can put a snare, I can put a build up and stuff, but I choose to keep it on the nice and beautiful low end and stuff. I use low end instruments, like for example anything that's in the low frequency, and I try to make sure that I just do my music production as best as I can. Do you understand? Because that's the important thing. So I realize now, since I'm actually doing my music production much better, for example, I realize I'm just telling you some ideas. I'm just giving you some ideas on how I do my music production, for example. So when I start arranging things, I make sure that the track in terms of live sounds good in terms of how it starts off. It can start off without a sub bass, you understand? So it can just be a kick with some percussion. And then once the melody, what I do is I every 8 bars, I change the track. Every single 8 bars. And I just stick to that. You understand? I stick to the track in terms of being able to change my track every 8 bars. You understand? And that's how I do my music production. And I make sure that I finish off my track between 6 minutes and 7 minutes. You understand? So it can be 6:30, it can be 6:40, it can be 6:12. You understand? As long as it's in the 6 minute range somewhere and below 7 minutes, I promise you, in between 6 and 7 minutes, my music tracks are in that range. You understand? And why is that? Because it's a music track that actually works and it sounds good. You understand? So the thing is that I can create 3 minute tracks, and that's a really, let's say, it's really fast to do that. So I try to expand my music as much as possible. You understand? I try to expand it to 6 minutes at least, so that I can at least have fun in my project, so I can have much more clarity about my direction in my music. You understand? So the more I do music production, for example, the better I get, and the more I learn stuff. So what I've learned recently as well is what you can do on Splice is you can get a trumpet hit. You understand? Like for example, one melody line of a trumpet. So the trumpet can go dun, and what you can do is you can get that sound. You can put it into your digital audio workstation or whatever you use in terms of FL Studio or digital audio workstations, and you can put it into your piano roll. And then what you can do is you can start really placing that note on any type of note in the piano roll, and you'll find that you can make a melody with it. So that's what I learned. And you have to understand now, since I master and EQ and reverb my music tracks better, I use a little bit of delay on percussion. You understand? I use delay on a synth that has a melody line, for example, as well, because I find delay is excellent with techno music. And the more you delay in music with techno music, the better it is. You understand? But sometimes it can go overboard. You understand? So make sure that you're never using too much delay. Make sure you're using delay where it's necessary. Make sure that you're EQing every single instrument in your repertoire, or any instrument that you're using in your mix. Make sure you have EQ on it, and make sure that you've EQ'd all the necessary parts of those frequencies that you need to cut out, for example. So for example, you'll see, like for example, sometimes, let's say a hat. You understand? A hat has a clap on it as well. You understand? So the thing is that you'll see a mid end and you'll see a high end more often in the equalizer, for example. So what you do is you'll see a little bit of a low end. You understand? In the equalizer. So cut off the low end and go much more, let's say, from mid end to high end, but try to make sure that that sound sounds the way you want it to sound in the mix. You understand? And that's all I say. So for example, now since I make 6 minute music tracks to 7 minutes, I realized I went to play my music just recently in the park somewhere because my dad was sleeping, and my music turned out great. I realized there was everything that I could hear in the music. For example, I can see my music's changing, for example. But what I also do is when I make a track, I make sure I put it on loop. Yes, now I put the song, I put it up to, so do you know how you go on song mode, for example, and then you have the first bar, second bar, third bar, fourth bar. So that's usually a 4 bar melody, yeah. So for example, I make sure that I use a 4-bar song loop, and then what I do is I add sounds to that. You understand? I add sounds to the 4-bar loops. You understand? So what you'll understand is I keep repeating the sound over and over again. You understand? And then I just add certain instruments into it, and then it sounds like a techno track because I'm using certain instruments with techno music. Do you understand? So with trance music, it's very different. I realize you need a good melody line with trance music, but trance music is much more difficult to make than techno music. In a sense, so you have to make a good amount of techno music to get to the point where you can make really good trance music. Yes, and then if you really make trance, then what happens is then you can start learning how to develop your hardstyle music, for example. Yes, and so it's really different, but hardstyle music is even much more difficult to make than trance music. Yes, and so why is that? Because there's more things going on in hardstyle, for example, but it's just basic stuff. You have to realize that if you have the knowledge to do it, then do it. But I realized that my direction in music production is techno music. I mean, it's 120 BPM techno music. So right now, I'm reaching a nice and beautiful pinnacle in my life right now in terms of my music production, and I'm really doing good. You understand? I'm really starting to make my first official album in my techno music after 5 years, guys. After 5 years of no music I mean, in terms of music production, after 5 years of music production, I started to make my first official techno album. Yes, and that's how long it took. So why did it take that long? I realized, well, since I made over 500 tracks, what's so different about these 4 tracks that those other tracks don't have? Well, the sound quality, the EQ, for example, wasn't good, and also the sound quality wasn't good, the mastering on it wasn't good. Also, you have to understand that that's it. That's it. Approach just sound quality, the EQing, and the mastering and the mixing as well. That wasn't good. You understand? So that's why my mixes, in terms of all those music tracks that I did make, I realized it's gonna be in my life forever. I can always look back on my music tracks and rebellish them in terms of being able to really listen to them and stuff. But that was a period in my time where I was doing something. You understand? I was still productive, and I stuck to my game. You understand? I said to myself, one day I will make great music. You understand? I said to myself, one day I'll get to that point where I'm gonna make great music. So right now, since I see, I always had that techno feel. You understand? I always had that nice and beautiful techno feel where I understood how to make techno, but I didn't really choose that direction because I was always going jazz. I was going between jazz and then psytrance and then hardstyle and then I was making R&B music and then I was making electronic dance music, house music. I was just jumping from fucking genre to genre without a direction in which direction I want to go in. And if you don't have a direction in your music in terms of which BPM you want to produce and which, for example, which genre you want to produce, if you don't know your genre and if you don't know your BPM, then I have to understand that you don't have an album today in that category. You understand? So that's why I chose techno 120 BPM, and that's what I'm sticking to. You understand? For this first album. And then my second album, I'm gonna do another techno track. I'm gonna do another 12 tracks of techno, and I'm gonna put it up on Spotify. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna promote it. I'm gonna go on the streets. I'm just gonna play my music, and I'm just gonna give out my CDs. I'm gonna have a CD. I'm gonna be able to sell my music on the street. And now I'm going to have a business card with that. And I'm going to give my business card along with that. So a business card is for free. But for example, it's just to get my name out there. So I want my name to be out there. For example, I want people to know my name. You understand? I want people to regard me as someone, you understand? But that's how it is in music production. First, you're an indie artist, you understand? You start on your own, and then you progress, and then you make your own success out of the world. You understand? So if people really like your music, I realize if they really are interested in your music, I promise they're going to buy from it. I'm pretty sure they're going to buy you. I'm pretty sure they're going to buy your music, do you understand? Because they like your music. But I also make jazz music. I listened to my jazz music tracks today, and I have to say there was just one tweak I could have made in terms of repeating the same melody when the vocal hits. And that's it. I promise you nothing else. I promise you maybe the vocal on some parts of the vocal was a little bit low in volume, but you can be heard that someone's singing. And you understand? And you have to realize that those are the only tweaks in my jazz music thing. But now that gives me more, let's say, privileges in my next music tracks in terms of jazz music and how it's going to turn out. I see also, guys, you have to understand that when you're making music, make sure it sounds good, for example. And you have to realize that you have to mix your mix below 12 dB. So some people say mix your projects between 3 dB and 6 dB in terms of minus 3 dB and minus 6 dB. But don't use this rule. I promise you, you know why? Because the music track is going to be louder at first, but the thing is that your mix is going to always be much more, let's say, hitting the clip. I mean, your music's going to clip unless you have a limiter on it. You understand? So what a limiter is a compressor. You understand? So for example, at the moment, I don't use compression in my music much because I don't need to. You understand? If I use compression, I use Sound Goodizer in my FL Studio. But I have a reason for that. But the thing is that what makes your track really tick is the reverb you put on it, and the EQ, and also the mix, and how you do your melodies, and what you put in the track. Yes, and that's what makes the melody tick. But you need to have a motor in there. You have to have some kind of nice melody that's going to really, really be ambient, but also that's going to be fast, and also that's going to be, let's say, nicely in the mix. You understand? So depending on what genre you're using, so for example, techno music, what I do is I use fast plucks, or I can use. I need something that is going to be consistent throughout the nice and beautiful mix. That's going to give me that punch that I need. For example, that's going to give me the bass line that's really like, for example. So you have to realize that that's a thing that I use Riff Machine. I use Riff Machine inside of FL Studio, and because I use Riff Machine, I just place 2 notes and I put it into one tone, and I place Riff Machine, and what happens is it gives me this nice and beautiful arpeggiator kind of thing, and that's why I use arpeggiation in my music. You understand? But also what I do is I like to use white noise in my music, so that it's going throughout the track, the white noise. And what I do is I press gross beat in FL Studio. I place gross beat on it, and I put a trance like to go through the mix. Do you understand? And I find that helps me to really, really make something much more worth it as well. So you have to realize that music production is a long game, guys, and you have to keep going. I realize you're going to have many failed attempts. I mean, look at me. I've made over 500 tracks in my life, and you have to realize that I've cut it down to 4 tracks. You understand? And something, you have to understand, something just clicked for me. I just said techno music, 120 BPM. You understand? I understand that something just clicked and said to me, I can make techno music. And my Adosco track is the one that really showed me that. When I was producing Adoska, I realized it doesn't sound really good, to be honest, that music track, because I didn't EQ it. I didn't mix it properly, for example. And I don't want to go back in it. I don't want to go back in it because it's just not worth it for me to start editing that. I can just go make a new track. Yes, and so the thing is that make sure you complete your music. Make sure you complete it. Make sure you finish off the track as much as you can, as best as you can. But then what you do is, if you don't want to edit your music tracks, then move on. You understand? So you have to understand that you can go back into your music tracks and re-edit them and stuff if you want to. But for my Adoska track, I realized that it's not worth it. Yes, it's not worth it, or else I can do better in other tracks. I can just see that. But Adoska, something happened in that music track where I showed myself something. And I was learning something. I was really learning something. I was learning how to loop my music track to just keep playing in the background while I add more sounds. And then I use Splice, and then I just add more sounds and more sounds and more sounds into it. And then suddenly it's just a techno track. But then once I add all the sounds in there, okay, once I have all the effects and all the sounds and all the melodies and all the percussion and stuff, what I do is I then start to EQ it. But what I do while I make the melodies and the percussion and the effects is that you have to understand what I do is I start to really, let's say, add reverb. I start to reverb my music track while I'm making the music track, in terms of while I'm making the loop on my music track. So what I mean is, while I start off, for example, let's say I started off my music production to make a track. I make the kick, I make the melodies, I make the effects, I make the percussion. But what I do in the meantime as well is I put the reverb on it. You understand? And then once I have all the sounds, all the effects, all the percussion, and all the melodies and all the kicks and stuff, I then start to EQ it. And once I EQ it, I then start to layer it. I start to do the layer. I start to do the arrangement, for example. And now, do I layer my music? I do layer it. I do layer it here and there, but I don't overuse layer. You understand? I don't overuse it. You understand? So you have to realize that in house music, for example, if you want your sound to sound really big, then you need the sounds, and you need to layer in your music as much as possible, as long as your DAW can handle it. So that's how I see it. But you have to realize, I can see how to make house music, for example. So house music is more techno music to begin with, and then a nice breakdown with a melody, for example, and then a build up into a nice and beautiful drop. You understand? And then once you have a drop, you put it for, let's say, 16 bars, for example. And then what you do is you go into another breakdown, okay? And now in your breakdown, you can have another melody, okay? And then what you do is you make sure that it's more techno, progressive in the breakdowns. And also it's much more how then it goes into another drop, and then it goes into an outro, for example. Do you understand? So that's how I would do it in house music. But that's 128 BPM. Do you understand? So that's how it is. So you have to realize that with house music, I don't really have the sounds to be able to make it. Do you understand? I don't have those sounds to be able to make it. I have sounds for techno. I have all the sounds for techno at the moment. I have a lot of sounds for techno, really, that I can make. You know, so it's much more how I'm using Harmless. I mean, Harmless is a great synth. It's really easy to use, and it gives you all the plucks that you want. I mean, anything that you want in pluck, it gives it to you. You understand? So it's much more how you detune. Make sure you use detune in your track, in your melodies and stuff. I realized that especially in techno music, if you're using detune, it sounds more like you're in a jungle somewhere. You understand? Personally, that's how it is with detune. And make sure you use detune, please. So you have to realize now, since I'm learning, I realized what else do I have to learn in techno music. I realized now for me in techno music is just about making my first album. I mean, making more tracks, and then I'll see exactly how to progress forward. But for the first time now, I see exactly how I don't need other people's vocals to make something happen for myself. Yes, and I don't need, for example, to go out there and pay money for vocalists to make a music track at the moment. I don't need that. I just need to make instrumental music right now and promote my instrumental music. And then once I get big, once I get really somewhere where I want to be with my music production career, I realize then I can start going and making vocals and stuff like that with my music track, you understand? And then maybe making a video hit, for example, and stuff. I mean, that's another story. But I'm finally getting to that point. Yes, I'm finally getting to the point where I've chosen the direction. I'm now going in that direction. You understand? So now it's just about helping myself grow. Yes, and just help myself grow the most I can. So that's how it is, guys, in music production. You have to stay consistent every single day. You have to make sure that you love your passion for music, and you just have to do a better job every single day. You understand? You just have to focus on better ways of life. You understand? So focus on helping yourself to really deliver content as much as possible. So what I do is I use a visualizer for my music now, whereas before I didn't have a visualizer, and I bought it. On Google Play Store, and I find that it works perfectly with Audio Spectrum with my music, and that's an excellent feature to have. For example, so for example, now you have to understand something, that I made Jujudan, which is a Balkan track recently, and I'm so impressed with my efforts. You understand? I'm so impressed with the way I made that track. You understand? So what did I make so different in this track that other tracks don't have? Well, the melody line. I realize the melody is the same as other melodies, but it's in techno version. And then it's like dun 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 dun. It's like that, you understand? So that's the melody, and then I'll go dun 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 dun, and you have to really listen to it. You understand? And then it goes dun na 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 dun na 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 na, and then it's just like it just really amplifies me. You understand? So the build up is really long in this track. And that's what makes it so great, you understand? So, for example, now with my Twinkle Little Star track, I realize you have to understand Jordan is 5 years in the making. I mean, that track right there, to make that kind of track that I made, is 5 years in the making. Yes, and because that's my 5 years of music production in the making to make that track. And now Twinkle Little Star is also 5 years in the making, but it's really 2 years in the making since I made I Twinkletopiya. You understand? So 2 years ago, I made a Twinkletopiya, which is my 1 hour set. I started making long music, like 1 hour sets and stuff. And now I can make 1 hour sets now. I understand how to make 1 hour sets, but it's such a long process that I'd rather make an album and sell my album and stuff and put it on Spotify than go out making sets like that. You understand? Because I don't have the time to make, let's say, 1 hour versions of sets when I can make a 6-minute track and then another 6-minute track and then another 6-minute track and then put that together, and that can be my 1 hour set. Yes, and that's different. Yes, and so now I'm realizing how I'm getting somewhere now with my music production, which is really good, and it's a nice and beautiful thing to just express yourself in any manner. So either in music production or in communication or whatever you can do, try to express yourself more. Yes, and try to do more for yourself. And the more you do, the better for you. Yes, and so I found that on my YouTube channel, for example, some videos have been partially visible to customers and to people online because I have copyright claims and stuff, because maybe someone's music was in the background playing and stuff, and it just, they made it partly visible to the world. You know what I'm saying? But I don't want to go and dispute that. I just let it be. I have I have over 1,890 videos on YouTube, and only maybe 10 videos are, let's say let's say around 10 videos are partly visible to the world. So I'm not going to stress about it, you understand? So, for example, you have to understand now with my music career, I realize things are going great. I realize now it's time to make more music, you know, and just make more music, see what you can come up with. Have fun in the process, guys. Make sure that you understand when you're making music, have fun in the process. Try to give out information to people as much as possible to learn from you and stuff on how you do music production and stuff. And you have to realize that it just works for everybody, for you to be able to teach others how you do music production as well. You know, I realize just make sure that the sound quality is great. Make sure you have reverb and delay in your mix, and make sure that you have a nice mix that's below 12 dB, in terms of below minus 12 dB, and also make sure that you master the track by using Maximus, and just click clear master, and then just click the preset clear master, and it will boost your track levels, and then it will boost the track. But you have to understand that just boosts, I mean, compression just boosts your volume in the track. That's it. That's all it does. You understand? But you have to realize that also, what I'm saying is that without a good mix, the mastering doesn't sound good. You understand? So without a good mix, the mastering doesn't sound good. But the better your mix is, the better your mastering. You understand? So you have to realize that. So now, EQ comes down to these things: EQ, reverb, mix, mastering, sounds. That's all it comes down to. You understand? So you have to realize that in your mix, you have to have a breakdown. Okay, you have to have. So what I do in my techno tracks is up to 2 minutes, the kick is going. And so the kick is happening for 2 minutes of the track. The first 2 minutes of my track is going and kicking. You understand? And then it goes into a downlifter, and then it just goes into a melody. You understand? And then from a melody, it builds up into a nice and beautiful kick again, and into a drop. You understand? And then that drop goes for, I mean, my breakdown goes for at least 1 minute to 1 minute and a half. You understand? And then what I do is I make the drop go for as long as the intro of my music. So my drop goes for 2 minutes. You understand? And that's how I do it. But I have one breakdown in my music tracks at the moment in my album. And that's how I do it. You understand? That's how I do it. I do 2 minutes first. I do the first 2 minutes is just kicking. I realize just having a kick with percussion and with sounds. And then it goes into a breakdown for maybe 1 minute to 2 minutes. And then what happens is I go into the nice and beautiful drop for 2 minutes. You understand? And that makes my track at least 6 minutes to 6 minutes and to 7 minutes. You understand? So that's how it is. So that's something else also that I'm explaining now. And also, what else about my music production is different? I realized it's just these recent skills I learned recently. I learned to detune, for example. I learned to EQ. I learned to reverb. For example, I learned to mix my track as well. I learned to master my track, for example. And also, I learned to pick the sounds. I learned how to make melodies. And so I learned how to make a motor for my track, which is a bass line. I learned how to make short little plucky sounds for my techno track. And I chose my direction too. Yes, and that's recently in the last week I've learned this. Yes, and so I'm really getting better now. Yes, and so anyway, guys, see you guys in the next program.